This is a true crime podcast. It contains adult themes and content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
You lost all constitutional rights the moment you walked through that door. When the judge sat down there, I sentenced you to 10 years at the Idaho State Penitentiary. You walked in that door, you was a number. And the inmates understood that.
If you're out there and live fast and furious, being here, just lay down and do it.
Those inmates that were here in the institution during an execution, it had an impression on them that maybe was still with them to some extent. Maybe they don't think about it anymore, but it had an impression on them, I'm sure.
They wouldn't let me out until I get back that stuff. 7 months later, I give it back to them.
That was one of the problems we ran into. Is you had 5 or 6 guys that were sitting in a place, smoking and joking and drinking coffee. Pretty quick, they'd hatched a plan in there to get under your skin some way or try to figure a way out.
Welcome back, folks, to another episode of the Behind Gray Walls podcast about the old Idaho State Penitentiary and the men and women who lived and worked here. My name's Anthony, and I am in the trenches with Samuel.
Hey, everybody.
And Skye.
Yay, I'm still here.
We're all together. It's so nice to be in the flesh with you two in the trenches. Woo.
Literally.
Yeah. Wow. It has been a week. We've just been working hard on the pod together. This is day 3 in a row that we've been able to record some episodes and share some stories. So.
And really interesting, cool stories, as always. It's been, I wish I could stay longer so we could record everything in person. But alas, I suppose I must get a job.
Oh, you have to imagine my hand gestures.
Trust me, they were fun yesterday. I will keep that image in my head. Just waving around. I was like, I love this. Get Sam at a festival. He'll be one of those big blow-up guys who just kind of blows in the wind.
The podcasts are great. It's the body language just adds a different component.
It's true.
It really does.
This is why you should come see us live.
Yeah.
Because we are kind of, you never know what's going to, I said feet pics in front of my parents and my grandmother. So
I think about that a lot. It just cracked me up. I was like, oh my God.
You just answered that too fast.
When you are a graduate student, you're just like, what are the easiest ways to make money? Donating plasma and feet pics. Anyway.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
See, it gets you every time, which is very funny to me.
I love it. It was just so fast. I was like a little bit wondering, like, is this a business that I'm a historian. I don't make a lot of money.
Yeah, right. There's a market for just about anything.
Is there a market for hairy, gross feet?
There genuinely might be. Like, people, you know what? No shame. I don't want to yuck someone's yum. Not my thing. My feet. This is so sad. I went to get a pedicure the other day, and the lady was like, she took out the cheese grater and was like basically like grating my heels, and it was disgusting. And then she got done, and she was just like, yeah, next time you come in, you need to do like a legitimate treatment on your feet, because my feet are like cracked and just, I'm on them all the time. I work them really, our feet are the true heroes.
When you said cheese grater,
dude,
it's so gross.
And like the amount of skin that was just, I was just like, how do you do that, like, without throwing up? Disgusting.
Yeah, like, I don't dust my house enough. I can't imagine what their countertops look like.
Oh man, so much feet talk. So anyway.
Speaking of
feet? Question mark?
Okay.
No.
That was a good transition.
Yeah, right.
Let's
no
step
feet
over
involved.
to your topic today.
Yes, definitely. So yes, no feet involved in my story, other than the weird things that come out of my mouth personally. So today is actually a very interesting story, as I think that they all are. But today I'm talking about Mrs. H.E. Brooks, number 4238. She's very interesting because she is the only one who came in under a Mrs. I thought we had her first name. Turns out we had her wrong first name. I will get into all of that.
Oh.
So, sources today, as usual, her inmate file from the Idaho State Archives, newspapers.com records, ancestry.com records, the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma website at choctawnation.com, an article titled Pocatello, Idaho as a Railroad Center by Robert Wrigley Jr., published in the October 1943 issue of Economic Geography, the history page on pocatello.gov, the ISHS reference series article titled The Name Pocatello, an article by Justin Smith titled Untangling the Complicated History of Pocatello's Name from the IdahoStateJournal.com, another article titled President of Pocatello Model Railroad and Historical Society Shares History That Built This Town and Why It Matters by Rhett Nelson on EastIdahoNews.com, and then just some quick Wikipedia articles, Utah and Northern Railway, Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, First Transcontinental Railroad, and the Oregon Short Line Railroad. So, Mrs. H.E. Brooks, who the penitentiary file records list her first name as Agnes, she was actually born Alice Esmond to William H. Esmond and Prudence Gertrude Halsey Esmond in Oklahoma, probably around 1893, but not really sure the day or month. Her early life was a little bit difficult to trace. I often found only one record that verified several of her family members, like in a record would have a sister here and so it's kind of hard to piece it together. But bear with me as I try my best to explain what I think I found about her life. So I first found an application submitted to the Mississippi Choctaw Indian tribe in 1902, in which Gertrude, Mrs. H.E. Brooks's mother, she was requesting to be identified as a member of the Choctaw Nation. She stated that she was 1/8 Choctaw through her mother, who had always claimed this Choctaw ancestry, and Gertrude was also trying to claim ancestry for her two daughters, Alice, who was 13 at the time, and Carrie, who was about 20 months old. And this petition was rejected by the Secretary of the Interior, I think mostly because they said she had always claimed it, so I don't think there was necessarily enough evidence to actually tie them into the nation. And Carrie, Alice's little sister, sadly passed away at just 3 years old in December 1903. According to Carrie's Find a Grave little website, her gravestone has this very sad little poem, and it says, "Papa and Mama, don't weep for me, but keep your promise and prepare to meet me."
Oh.
I know, isn't that so sad?
How old was she?
She was 3.
3?
Yeah.
Oh,
just
man.
a little baby, I know.
That always breaks my heart.
I know.
Like the family heritage website where you see like 0 months, 10 days and stuff like that. Oh,
yeah.
I'm always like, gee, ugh.
I know. And back, and like, in Oklahoma in the early 1900s, like it's just rural and primitive and, who knows how far away the closest doctor is.
And so normal
Yeah.
to lose.
Yes.
You have a brood of 10 children, 6 survive.
I know. However, the small Esmond family continued to live in Oklahoma at least through 1900, where they kept a boarding house in the very official-sounding Township 6 in Choctaw Nation territory. Records seem to point to the family living in or near Colgate, Oklahoma, which still currently sits inside the Choctaw Reservation. And here's like a very small rabbit hole. From the official Choctaw Nation website, the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma is the largest of the 3 federally recognized bands of the Choctaws and is the 3rd largest federally recognized tribe in the U.S. Its current reservation is nearly 11,000 square miles, which is over 6 million acres. And it's in southeastern Oklahoma. It's the 2nd largest reservation in the United States after the Navajo Reservation, which is down in Arizona. And so, if Alice grew up on the reservation and her mother tried to claim Choctaw ancestry, it of course is very likely that she was very familiar with Choctaw tribal members and Choctaw culture. But it is important to note that on the censuses and other records, Alice and her family are listed as white. But they probably grew up, in the milieu of that. So there are a few years that, as usual, we lose track of her, but we find her next in Colorado in 1907 when she marries a man named George F. Stewart. And I don't know how or why she got to Colorado. I don't think her family lived there or like her parents moved there. But George F. Stewart, he was a native Coloradan whose father was a harness maker and a laborer, and George followed in his father's trade. So George and Alice lived together in Sterling in Logan County, Colorado, about 120 miles northeast of Denver. And their son Ralph was born just a year after their marriage in about 1908. And then in the 1910 census, we find them living in Sterling, Colorado, where George worked as a harness maker, and I think he might have had his own shop. But something must have happened, and the couple divorced sometime before 1914. And I know this because I found a marriage record for George to someone else in 1914. Plus, in 1915, there is a marriage for Alice Esmond in Parsons, Kansas, to a man named Harder Edward Brooks, I-E-H-E, Brooks. Oh. H.E. was born in Indiana in 1878, and he moved to Kansas in his youth. In 1898, he married a woman named Mary A. Tussing, and together they had 3 children, Daisy, Harry, and Hazel. H.E. worked on the railroad in Kansas, a profession that I think he would work for the rest of his life. So Harder, or H.E., and Mary must have divorced, and within 2 years after H.E. had married Alice, the couple had moved to Pocatello. And so I also wonder, because she was in Colorado and Kansas, a lot of times that Midwest really trips me up, but Kansas is right next to Colorado, which I often forget. So it doesn't seem out of the realm that she would have maybe gone back east a little bit. So just some brief Pocatello Railroad history. I've talked about Pocatello a couple times before, but I do think it's been a while. So I'll do kind of a quick overview of Pocatello history with an emphasis on the railroad, because it always has been a huge railroad center. So for those of you who don't know, Pocatello is in southwestern Idaho, less than 100 miles away from both the Utah border to the south and the Wyoming border to the west. The area was inhabited by Shoshone and Bannock peoples for hundreds of thousands of years. Pocatello as a city was founded in 1889 and quickly gained the nickname Gateway to the Northwest as pioneers, gold miners, and other settlers traversed the Oregon Trail, which passed through the south of town. And it became a very important junction for transportation, trade, and stage freight and train lines. So the name Pocatello has a really interesting history. The long accepted story was that Pocatello was taken from the name of a local indigenous leader, and the assumption is that he was named Chief Pocatello, but Justin Smith of the Idaho State Journal said that the chief it is supposedly named after used the name Tonzausha or Tanioza. So, how the name Pocatello came about is very uncertain. The ISHS reference series, which you can find online, says that there is no linguistic equivalent in either Shoshone or Bannock languages for the word Pocatello, or like any of the parts that make it up. Only the first syllable po is an actual Shoshone word. It means road or trail. But after that initial syllable, nothing has any real meaning in the local indigenous languages. In fact, the name Pocatello has to be altered slightly to even be pronounced in either the Shoshone or Bannock languages. Regardless, this Chief Pocatello, or whatever his real name was, apparently granted the railroad a right-of-way through the Fort Hall Reservation, perhaps leading town founders to name the town after him, which is, again, curious, because we don't know how that name Pocatello came about. It's kind of like the name Idaho. Like, no one knows where that comes from, right, but it, means so much to us now. So the first permanent white settlement came with Fort Hall in 1834, just a few miles north of town. Over the next several years, Fort Hall was an important trading post in the fur trade and eventually became a supply point for those travelers on the Oregon Trail. Of course, with the gold rush following the discovery of gold in 1860, the Port Neuf Valley, in which Pocatello sits, was the central corridor for stage and freight lines. Of course, in the late 1860s, 3 railroad lines cooperated with the U.S. government to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and this Transcontinental Railroad ran from Council Bluffs, Iowa, to the San Francisco Bay. And the way that they built it is they had one team start in the east, in Iowa, and another team start in San Francisco, and then they would just slowly work their way together and meet in kind of theoretically the middle. But in May 10th, 1869, the last spike was driven into this Transcontinental Railroad at Promontory Summit in Utah. And so if you've ever driven from Idaho down into Utah through I-84, you've probably seen signs just past Snowville for Promontory Point. And this is where they drove that spike and, finished the Transcontinental Railroad, which is very exciting. I've actually never been to the site. Have you been, Anthony?
I have, yeah. It's actually pretty cool. Yeah. They have a lot of trains, of course, on display. They have this nice museum space where they talk about this. I definitely recommend it. And occasionally they actually start these steam engines. And you get to hear it and see it, and just like, humans are amazing. Yeah. I can't believe we can do something like this.
Well, and it's so crazy too to think about how like primitive that technology seems now.
Yeah.
But how advanced and like
revolutionary.
Revolutionary it was. Like suddenly you could travel across the country in just a couple days, right?
Right,
And you got to be kind of inside a car, protected from the weather. Trains are huge, obviously.
Yeah. Oh my
Well, and mapping mass migration before 1869, it's a trickle, and then after 1869, all of a sudden the West is just being flooded with just immigrants from everywhere.
Well, and so you know, one of the big reasons, as we I'm sure have talked about, that at least in the earliest days of Boise, there were so many Chinese residents was because they had been hired for the railroad to work the railroad, and then when that railroad was completed, they needed to go somewhere. And I think if you can find pictures of the ceremony of the Golden Spike, you will see a lot of those Chinese laborers because they were so central to building the railroad in the West.
Actually, not to be that guy, but the Golden Spike photo, they asked all of the Chinese immigrants to step aside for the photo.
Right, yeah.
And so after the photo, apparently they had like a speech to the Chinese immigrants and were given like a little celebration, but they weren't allowed to partake.
So
of the
maybe
white
I've seen the ones of them
published,
leading up to that official photo,
Yeah.
because I know I've seen pictures of it.
Yeah,
So
totally.
Yeah.
Read Ghosts of Gold Mountain, so good. So good.
I love this. I was like, not to be that guy, and then you were. No, it's
Yeah.
fine. No,
Yeah.
we appreciate it.
Totally. There's like the official published
Yeah.
image
Yeah.
of the white investor.
That very famous one with the golden spike.
Yeah.
The fat cats who didn't do any of the labor and got all the money for it.
Exactly.
What a crazy feat, though.
Yeah.
That would have been so
seriously
hard. Especially the Pacific to the...
Yeah. Up
East?
through the mountains cause like a
Sierras?
huge issue. Yeah. And that's why, because really when you look at it, Iowa to Utah is a significant amount compared to San Francisco to Utah, but it's because they had to go up and down the mountains, which is significantly harder on the workers, harder for the railroad trains to make sure like the grade isn't too steep and all the things, engineering and things that takes, and making tunnels and mountains and stuff. So, yeah. So then, after this, the Transcontinental Railroad and the Golden Spike, that happens. Then, in the mid to late 1870s, the first railroad, called the Utah and Northern Railway, which was originally conceived of and built by Mormon pioneers because no other railroad company showed any interest in building a railroad spur for settlers living in Cache Valley, was begun. So, Cache Valley is where Logan, Utah is. I went to school there. And again, nestled in the mountains, but they really didn't want to build in this little tiny area. So these Mormons built the Utah Northern Railway. It went from Cache Valley in Utah all the way up into Idaho. And the original Cache Valley went over the border. So at that point, it wasn't called the Utah Northern. It was actually just called the Utah Northern Railroad. So because they thought this original Cache Valley was part of Utah, surprise it isn't, they then extended the railroad into the state by 1874. Then in 1878, Robert Bear and Jay Gould of the Union Pacific bought the Utah Northern Railroad, changing the name to Utah and Northern Railway, and extended the line from just west of Brigham City, Utah, through Pocatello, Blackfoot, and Idaho Falls, all the way through to Garrison, Montana. In 1889, the Utah and Northern merged with the Oregon Short Line Railroad, which connected Granger, Wyoming to Huntington, Oregon, and Pocatello was a major stop along that route. So the railway and the railroad has always been an important part of the Pocatello economy and has helped contribute to Pocatello's nickname of the Gateway of the Northwest. It also had an important roundhouse, and roundhouses are buildings in which the train, so there's, a dead end on the trail, and then all of these sort of like, almost like a stable, all these areas for the trains to go in, they could get fixed, cleaned up, and they could stock them with food and water, and that was another big reason Pocatello was an important stop. In 1934, Robert Wrigley Jr., he wrote that Pocatello, quote, functions chiefly as a repair, transfer, fuel, and administrative center for the Union Pacific, end quote. And Pocatello also served as a central hub through which major agricultural imports and exports in the southern part of the state moved around and moved in and out. At the time, Pocatello also had significant passenger train travel, but that has really, of course, all since disappeared with the disappearance of regular train passenger travel by the 60s and 70s. Yeah. This is a loss I lament every day of my life.
Me too.
There is nothing I have ever wanted more. Okay, that's not true ever, but there's like nothing I want more than to like take this old-fashioned passenger train across the country.
Man,
seems amazing.
Have you guys ever ridden on a long train trip? Or?
I haven't done too long.
I've done a lot of speed trains, like in China, and then I've done the there's one like speed train from somewhere in South Idaho to Salt Lake, and I've taken that a couple of times, but it's not that like old fashioned. It's much more like a bus.
Yeah, that makes sense. Or like I've been on the trains, that went from like Baltimore to Philadelphia, those like commuter trains.
They go so fast, and it's like, do you want that sleepy
nothing
old?
Like let me pull down my bunk, with the steam and stuff.
Becky and I took one from Seattle down to L.A.
Ooh.
And that's actually where I proposed, was on a train to Becky. So at midnight, just during this kind of romantic voyage to L.A.
Oh,
super cool.
That's so fun.
So that's the only time I've ever been on one.
So it would have been a sleeper train.
Yeah.
But they just didn't have the... Oh, it was?
We had our own little sleeping car, which was amazing. But they didn't have... They were supposed to have this like big like glass where it's just a glass top so you can just see everything. And I was really hoping...
So cool.
I don't know why I didn't really think through, but I was like, there's gonna be a midnight fireworks show. It's gonna be romantic and beautiful, but it was just pitch black.
You were just like so
in our little room.
How were the beds uncomfortable?
No, we slept great. It was really fun. I really highly recommend, if you can, just to like have that blast of the past. It's very like hypnotic, and every meal you have is going to be with other passengers, and it's going to be with strangers. It forces you to really engage with strangers and stuff. But it was really fun. I really want to do the one that goes through Canada and through the wilderness. So that's our plan, is to go to Chicago, go north, and then take it to Chicago and spend some time in Chicago and come back. So
my friend and I think towards the end of COVID, we were so desperate to like get out that we were like, what if we took an Amtrak from Dallas to Chicago and just like had a weekend? And it never worked out, but I was like, I want to stay in this sleeper train so bad.
Yeah.
I have watched too many old movies. It's fine. So anyway, back to our Union Pacific in Pocatello. So by 1934, the Union Pacific employed approximately 2,800 local workers and hired an extra 300 to 500 workers during the late summer and early fall, and that's when the produce was normally harvested, so they needed more workers. And one of those 2,800 regular employees was Mr. H.E. Brooks, who worked as a switchman on the Oregon Shortline Railroad. In 1917, in Pocatello, he was living with his wife Alice and his stepson Ralph, and he was working as an assistant yard manager for the Oregon Shortline. By 1920, he'd been promoted to full yard master, and the family owned their home on South Hay Street in Pocatello. And they live a very normal life. There is absolutely nothing that would suggest they had anything but a normal, law-abiding time while they were living in Pocatello. But unfortunately, all of that changed in 1928. On Saturday, June 16th, 1928, Alice, along with her mother Gertrude and two friends, a Mrs. Van Epps and a Mr. John Walters, and I think both of these guests were employed by some way, like either Mrs. Van Epps' husband was and Mr. John Walters were both connected or employed by the Oregon Shortline. So all four of these people are driving. The Salt Lake Tribune reported they had been visiting a ranch outside of town where they picked up some fresh eggs and some buttermilk. Honestly, sounds like the most beautiful rural activity. Again, missed that so much. And as they're coming back into town, they were driving north on South Grant Avenue in Pocatello, approaching the intersection of South Grant and West Holiday Street. So Grant Avenue had a downgrade to it. So in other words, Alice is driving downhill, and then you hit the intersection, and then Holiday starts to go up again. So the intersection's kind of a neutral zone, down and then up. So at this intersection, a car described as a quote-unquote Ford Bug, which I don't know what that is, entered the intersection first, but within seconds, Alice had rushed her car into the intersection herself. And smack dab in the middle of the intersection, the front of Alice's car hit the back end of the smaller Ford Bug, which was driven by 16-year-old James McQuaid. James was the third of 5 sons, born to Joseph McQuaid, a Canadian-Irish immigrant, and Mary Farnan McQuaid. By 1928, his parents had divorced and his mother had remarried, but Joseph, James's father, was a railroad machinist, and so if he worked for the Union Pacific, there is a possibility that Alice and or H.E. knew James and knew the family. So both newspapers and official documents state that James' car had been, quote, hurled against a fire hydrant, end quote, and Alice's car had been tipped over onto its side. So she hit him pretty hard to the point that it shoved his car into this fire hydrant on the other side of the street. Hers had been turned over on its side. James's car had actually just been kind of turned around, but that shows she was moving at a very fast pace. And after the smoke had cleared, James was found lying on the ground with injuries to his head, but the cause of his injuries could not be definitively determined. Some newspaper accounts said that James had gotten out of the car voluntarily to try to avoid getting hurt, but, quote, was caught by the wreck, end quote. And he died. They took him to the hospital, and he died of his injuries. So in the investigation of this accident, witnesses say that she was driving way too fast, and the prosecution points to this and says his car was, entirely turned around. And within a couple months, the prosecuting attorney charged Alice with involuntary manslaughter, quote, alleging that she negligently and carelessly and without due caution operated a car she was driving in such a manner that it caused the death of one James McQuaid, end quote. She pleaded not guilty to the charges, and her trial began in September 1928. The trial was fairly simple, with Alice testifying she was not driving more than 10 miles an hour when the accident occurred. Her mother also testified, as well as some other eyewitnesses regarding the accident, but I couldn't find any extra details about this testimony. The state's prosecuting attorney, H.J. Swanson, emphasized the witness accounts of Alice's high rate of speed, as well as the fact that her own car had been turned over as proof that she had been driving too fast. On November 22nd, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, but they recommended that Judge J. Downing provide some leniency in sentencing Alice. And the judge sentenced her to 8 to 18 months at the Idaho State Penitentiary. So, all in all, a pretty light sentence for this accident. Less than a week later, a stay of execution was granted after Alice posted a $2,000 bond because Alice's lawyer had filed motion for a new trial, which this was a twist I had not remembered from the first time that I had done this. So the biggest piece of evidence that the defense was claiming for a new trial was that James McQuaid's mother, Mrs. R.V. Fields, had prejudiced the jury. The Idaho Statesman reported that during a courtroom recess, as the jury left the courtroom, Mrs. Fields, quote, exhibited to members of the jury a photograph and conversed with the members of the jury concerning the photograph, end quote. It's not clear what this photograph is of. There's another report that says it was a photograph of the accident scene, perhaps in an attempt to sway the jury to talk about how bad it was. There also is a possibility, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a second, but there is a possibility that James McQuaid's mother was showing a picture of another accident in which Alice might have been involved in to say, look, she's done this once before. Though the details of this case are a little bit unclear, the case ends up going all the way to the state Supreme Court, and it was not heard by the state Supreme Court until May 1930. So she's out for about a year and a half, waiting for it to reach the Supreme Court. They end up affirming her manslaughter verdict because they, quote, found no reversible errors, end quote, or any evidence of jury tampering. And so, Mrs. H.E. Brooks, Alice Brooks, entered the Idaho State Penitentiary on June 20th, 1930, about 18 months after she was first sentenced. So her intake form, name, Mrs. H.E. Brooks, crime, involuntary manslaughter, age 37, height 63 7/8 inch, weight 151 pounds, build medium, hair brown, eyes gray, I think is what that says, complexion light, mustache none, born 1893, Oklahoma, occupation housewife. So not a ton. I don't even think she had a Bertillon. Wasn't very much really on her. The women's ward building outside of the main prison walls was less than a decade old by the time Alice entered the prison under the name Mrs. H.E. Brooks. She was only the 5th inmate in the women's ward when she came in, but one of the inmates was Mary Crumroy, who might not have even been in Boise while Alice was there. Within months of her incarceration, Alice was applying for pardon, and I found this notice of intention to apply for pardon, which they had to publish in the newspapers in case anyone... It's usually to inform the public, right? If the public has any issues, they can bring it up to the Board of Pardons, right? Isn't that why they do that? Mm-hmm. Okay. So this intention to apply for pardon was that she would apply in the October 1930 meeting of the Board of Pardons. And there are a few important documents attached to this application for her pardon. The first was a petition from residents of Pocatello asking that Alice be released, and it reads, quote, "Whereas, on the 28th day of June, 1928, Mrs. H.E. Brooks of Pocatello, Idaho, unfortunately became involved in an accident whereby her car collided with another at the center of an intersection of 2 streets in the city of Pocatello, and as a result of which the driver of the other car lost his life. And, whereas Mrs. Brooks was thereafter tried upon a charge of manslaughter, and the jury returned a verdict of guilty with recommendations to the court of leniency, and she was thereafter sentenced by the court to serve a term in the Idaho Penitentiary for a period of not less than 8 or more than 18 months, and whereas the crime for which she was committed does not involve moral turpitude, and it is believed that the ends of justice will be best subserved by issuing to her a full and complete pardon. Now, therefore, we, the undersigned, residents and citizens of the state of Idaho, do most respectfully petition your honorable body to grant a full and complete pardon to Mrs. H.E. Brooks," end quote. There are about 21 signatures on the copies that we have in the file. I'm not sure if it's all of it, if they just sort of needed, a good chunk just to show that people were. Mm-hmm. The second document attached is a deposition from a man named J.E. Fox, who had been selected as the 13th member of a jury. And so he was an extra juror who was selected just in case anything happened to the primary 12. So he sat it through the entire trial, but he didn't sit through jury deliberations. But he had to sit and wait and hear the verdict. So apparently, just after the jury had returned the verdict, but before it had been announced in court, Fox bumped into Mr. Hughes, who was the jury foreman, and Fox asked Hughes what the verdict was. Hughes said the jury had found her guilty, and Fox asked, quote, "How did you convict her on that evidence?" End quote.
Why shouldn't she be found guilty? That isn't her first offense. She killed another person in a car accident, as we understand, somewhere near Nampa.
Which is interesting. So this is where the question of was his mom showing a picture of this other accident? Because as far as I can tell, there was no mention in the trial of this other accident.
Which, you're not being tried on it. You're not allowed to,
exactly.
Which makes sense. But, oh, boy.
Yeah, and so that's where I was like, if this is really the reason that they convicted her, I would absolutely be arguing for a new trial because... I've never found anything in the newspapers that mentioned it, and it never said, oh, this isn't the first time Mrs. Brooks has gotten in an accident. Yeah. So, if this is truly the reason that the jury found her guilty, that seems based in some pretty circumstantial evidence, which is not how our judicial system is supposed to work. So yeah, there doesn't seem to be mention of it in any other sources. I also wonder, again, if this is the reason that the defense team tried to appeal, but the deposition wasn't taken until late September 1930 when she was already in prison. So that, brings up a whole other set of questions of if that's the reason, why did he not come out? And why did the defense not talk to him before? There's lots of questions as to what is the real story here? Yeah. Then, in this application, there's a letter written to Governor H.C. Baldridge from H.G. Swanson, who was the prosecuting attorney who put Alice in prison, and part of it reads, quote, "It has come to my attention that you have been urged to grant a reprieve to this woman, and after giving this matter full consideration, I have concluded to write you joining in this request. This woman has, in all probability, already had her full measure of punishment, first in going through a somewhat protracted trial, next in awaiting the final action of the Supreme Court on her appeal, and, in addition, having now served a portion of her sentence in the penitentiary," end quote. And so the governor replied, quote, "I thank you for your statement as to what you believe to be the facts in connection with the case. I have no desire to do in this case or any other except that which seems to be the right thing," end quote. And so Swanson also sent a letter to Fred Lukens, who was Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State was on, which I think is cool that we have, a member of the government on this Board of Pardons. Swanson's letter to Lukens is fairly similar to what he'd written to Governor Baldrige, again recommending that the board give Alice a pardon. And then lastly, the application itself included a multi-page argument from Alice's lawyers about why clemency should be shown to her in this case. And it includes this important paragraph, which lists several different reasons that even a few months was more than enough for her stay at the penitentiary. Quote, "The reasons for clemency which involve your applicant has to offer are these. The offense of which she was convicted does not involve any moral turpitude and resulted from an accident which she used every effort to avoid. That the grief of the applicant over the death of the boy resulting from said accident, in addition to her being convicted and incarcerated in the state penitentiary, has preyed severely upon her mind and is undermining her health. That the mother of your applicant, who was riding in the car at the time of the accident, was also injured, and her health, since said accident, has been very poor, and she is now under a physician's care, and your applicant's confinement in the penitentiary is undermining the health of her mother. Further, applicant is needed at home to take care of her mother, who has no other person to look after her, or no means of support other than what care and support your applicant and her husband are able to furnish her. Applicant has never before been charged with any offense against the laws of the state of Idaho or the United States or the violation of any municipal ordinance," end quote. And honestly, all these arguments seem fair to me. And Alice's case was indeed discussed at the October Board of Pardons meeting, but despite everyone's letters and petitions, she was not pardoned, but her case was commuted to 8 months, period. So she was released after exactly 8 months on February 20th, 1931. So Alice's post-prison life is difficult to trace, and if that's purposeful, I can't necessarily blame her. I have no doubt there's a huge social stigma for women who had spent time in prison. You know, we talked in the live episode, I read those poems and those sort of editorials that talk about, like, you know, a woman is seen as this marked woman forever if she's been in prison, and this was clearly an accident. Mm-hmm. So I found in 1940 that Ralph's World War II registration card lists Alice as the person who would always know his address. She was living at 1217 North Arthur Avenue in Pocatello, which, if it's the same house on which the lot, so like I went and looked up the address on Google Maps, and it's like a little house, and it's very cute, and it looks like it could have been from that time. So like if it's the same house, whoever lives in there, very lucky, very cute. At some point, she, her husband, and her son, and possibly her mother, all moved to Los Angeles, maybe in the late 1950s. So H.E. passed away in Los Angeles in October 1957. It says in his obituary, quote, "His widow, who survives, lives at 5221 Hub Street," end quote, in Los Angeles, but no name is given for this widow. Ralph passed away in March 1971, and I couldn't find a record that stated any reason for his death, but he was only 53 and died in a hospital. He was survived by his brother Harry, who's his stepbrother from H.E.'s first marriage, and his mother, Mrs. Alice Brooks of Los Angeles. However, it did list that his residence was on Hub Street, which we know from H.E.'s obituary that his widow lives at 5221 Hub Street. So I do think that this unnamed widow in H.E.'s obituary was, in fact, Alice. Mm-hmm. Ralph's 1971 obituary is the last record for her that I could find. Wow. And so she lived the rest of her life as a normal citizen, stayed out of trouble, and I hope she had a good rest of her life and, you know, was able to heal from what undoubtedly was a very difficult couple years of her life. And, you know, Los Angeles is beautiful, so I hope she got to go soak up the rays and you know, kind of have fun in LA in the 1960s and 70s, which undoubtedly was like crazy. So I hope she had a good rest of her life. And so that is our short and sweet story of Mrs. H.E. Brooks. Nice. It's Alice Esmond Brooks.
Alice Esmond. Oh man.
Well, great job, Skye. It's always a tough story with like car accidents because like I could understand how angry the family would be, especially if there had been a previous one. But it's also a weird place because like in the 1920s, like they're kind of still figuring out what legal repercussions car accidents should have. Right. Yeah. You know, and I feel like nowadays there's a little more regulation of like what would define going too fast, what would define driving reckless.
Yeah. Like safety features were like a second afterthought, you know.
Yeah, like
just figuring out
probably no seatbelts or
and even with the feelings of the family aside, at like what Brooks would have felt, like the guilt she would have had to struggle with for the rest of her life.
Yeah. Did she wear glasses or anything like that? Or?
So her mugshot that we have, she isn't. But, you know, as we get older, I'm sure, you know, my parents are at the age where they have to do the bifocal thing. They're always holding papers away from their face and stuff. And so she, you know, was 37. And I also wondered, you know, going back to this idea that it's so new that, like, maybe she didn't have terrible eyesight, but maybe she should have had some sort of corrective lenses and, like, maybe the steep, the downhill grade of the hill was like more than she thought. And, you know, it's so hard. But also I can absolutely understand why the family was so upset. He was 16 years old. He had his whole life in front of him. Someone struck down at such a young age. And from, by all accounts, a close-knit family. I think he had all brothers. And I think he was, if I remember correctly, kind of in the mix of all of them. And his father, you know, worked for the railroad. And Pocatello, especially, I think that railroad community is probably very close. Yeah. So, you know, I can't blame the family for, you know, if they tried to sway the jury. You know, they're just trying to get justice for their son. And, yeah, very complicated story. Very, you know, such a good point that it is so early in cars. And so they are trying to figure out, like, what do we do about these kind of cases? And it did say that she felt an immense amount of guilt. She was very sorry for what had happened. Just in a sad, interesting, with the, you know, trying to get a new trial and stuff like that. But like I said, I hope she had a good life out in sunny LA at the very least. And it's nice that she and H.E. stayed married, because sometimes, you know, when women go into, and men too, when anyone goes into prison, oftentimes marriages don't survive that. And so clearly H.E. was very supportive of her and was very close to her son for her whole life. So there are certainly many, many redeeming qualities to her. It just, unfortunately, these are the things that just sometimes kind of happen. So just be so careful. Like, I always go on these rants of, you know, we all get in these like 2-ton boxes of metal and drive them crazy around the streets and hope that no one else hits us with their big 2-ton metal box. Yeah. And, you know, with how tech filled they are and like with all of our modern distractions, like, put your phone down, like, just drive, you know, just be careful, because you don't want to kill someone, period. You know, you don't want to go to prison for it, but also you just don't want that on your conscience. So be careful, put your phone down, drive with all of your senses available. Just be so careful.
Well, great job.
Thank you.
Good research. It's an interesting story, even if it has difficult moments.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, nice job. I love the railway.
Yes.
You know, if you want to stay safe, that's probably one of the safest ways to travel.
Let's all just start petitioning all of our government leaders. I want a country, like a countrywide high-speed train. It's what we deserve, dang it. I would die if we had that.
Thanks for listening to this episode. New this season, Samuel, Bryn, and Mariah, staff members at the site, and myself, we've been going out into the prison yard and interviewing visitors. Some familiar with the podcast and others who are visiting for the very first time. We just want to capture what is their experience at the old pen like. Today, I interviewed Brian Troyer.
Oh, yeah, sure. My name is Brian Troyer. Gemini. My birthday was 2 weeks ago.
A volunteer at the Old Pen and a podcast fan. What do you like about the Behind Gray Walls podcast? And or do you have a favorite episode or something you've learned from it?
I've always said I think I missed my calling in following history. I work in retail for a living. And as I've lived in Idaho now about 32 years and never visited until last year.
Oh my gosh.
And ever since then, it's been this is my favorite historical place in Idaho. I've been to, you know, Rocky Bar and a lot of places, but every time I come here, I learn something new. And every time I come here, I meet somebody new. And it's just so fascinating to me that people share the same kind of passion as me, maybe to a higher level. And meeting those people and having the opportunity to volunteer, and it's great. So the podcast is a piece of that, learning about what happened inside of these walls. And last year when I volunteered for Squawky and Spirits, I was telling some coworkers, and one coworker said that her dad was incarcerated here. And I was like, what? And she said something about him stealing a ham, and I just heard that episode. Yeah. But come to find out, it was a different ham stealing story. And so she told me all about it, and all these other stories, and the fact that her father was like bedmates in the hospital with Harry Orchard. And I just, that's why I keep coming back, and it's just great. And then the podcast, I'll listen to it going to bed, I'll listen to it driving to work, I'll listen to it coming home from work, on road trips. Yeah. It's just, I can't get enough, and I have not even listened to every episode, and I'll find myself kind of going back to the beginning. So I sell plants for a living, and I was very upset that you guys covered the state flower and the state bird and, the butterfly, but Idaho state shrub is the Idaho blue fescue, if you didn't know that.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah, so I
don't think
I
that
sell
was
those.
On my mug. Yeah,
It wasn't on your mug.
I had a mug with all the state, logos and the fossil and everything else. So, but I don't think the shrub was on there. That's
and it's kind of cool. So the Idaho Geology building is right next door. My dad is a huge rock hound. So when I leave here today, I'm going to his house in eastern Oregon, and we're going up rock hounding in the Owahis. Awesome. So it's just it's stuff like that it's my pull away from the outside world and just learning about history and being outdoors, and even though you're in these walls, you're outdoors. And
so we learn every time we make an episode. This is a lot of it's new to us. We're like, wow, this is a really cool part of Idaho history. So to be able to share that, and for people to be like, whoa, that gives me more appreciation of the natural surrounding area and then settlement. Has there been anything about the history of the old pen that has taken you by surprise?
For me, it was learning about Siberia. I mean, I always assumed there was kind of a solitary here, but when I did the evening tour a week ago, was my first time actually going in there. I've been here a couple times, but every time there were so many people, there's so much going on that I'm like, I'll just stay back and take it all in. So actually going in there, I learned that people would be in there, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 6 months. I think I heard a year in a couple instances. Just trying to put myself in that mindset for even a second, and trying to imagine somebody having to do that for 12 months. It's really brings being a human being and how the mind can easily break, and breaking it in there. It's fascinating and scary and like all those things at the same time.
Yeah. Have you or anyone in your family ever experienced incarceration?
Nobody in my family that I can think of, not my immediate family, has been incarcerated. I'm sure a lot of people in my family have probably done things that could have got them incarcerated. I was visiting with my uncle that I have not seen in a couple years, and I forgot that he was a Caldwell Police Department detective, a lieutenant in charge of all the detectives on the SWAT team, and the chief of police. So I was talking to him about the podcast and the old Idaho Pen, and I was surprised. He's lived here all his life and was in law enforcement and has never visited here. So we're working on trying to get him to come here and just have him go take a look at 4 and 5 House and see what it compares to, maybe the Caldwell jail and tell some stories. It was really fascinating. We just sat there for an hour while everybody's barbecuing and playing cornhole off to the side, and we're just sitting there chatting a lot about this place and the podcast and you, and you might not think so, but to me, you and Skye and everybody, you're like celebrities to me. I just can't get enough.
That's so funny to hear.
And I do have to say, listening to your voice for probably a year before I actually had a chance to meet you at Squawky and Spirits, you are exactly what I imagined, because you had a little bit longer hair at the time, and You are what I pictured in my head.
That's hilarious. We do this just quietly by ourselves. It's just, and we send it out to the world, and I try not to think about it or do anything else beyond that. So to hear folks that are like tuning in all the time, and it just means so much. It really does.
I felt so terrible because you were so busy and had so many things going on. And I'm like, hey, I've got a story about a coworker or, hey, this. And you're like, yeah, tell me about it later. So being able to talk to you and email the podcast and have this opportunity is just another reason why people should just love this place.
Oh, I appreciate that. I think I've hit my key questions. Is there anything else that you'd like to say, comment on, talk about?
Can we talk about the ghosts?
Yes. Yeah. Tell me about your experience.
So I was in Five House.
Yeah, in the infirmary.
In the infirmary. Yeah. So I was the last kind of scare actor as people were coming out. And I volunteered both nights, all night, so I didn't get to experience anything else.
Yeah.
None of the food, which smelled great. I didn't get to walk around, see everything else. But the first night I was there, I was partnered with another woman that was like an undead nurse, if you will. Mm-hmm. And we had just met, we barely talked, and she would sit there in between customers coming through, putting her fingers on the table next to her, just kind of waiting. And about an hour in, I felt it. I was wearing like this scarecrow kind of helmet thing, and I felt that twice on my head.
On your head?
And then a couple people come through, and I could tell there was nobody else in the hall because you can kind of hear things. And it got really hot in the helmet, so I took it off for a second. I was like, did you rub your hands on the helmet? And she didn't know who I was. She was like, no. But I very clearly felt it on me. So I go home, and I didn't say anything to anybody for a week because I'm like, maybe it's in my head or, but maybe it's not. So after a week, I told my girlfriend, I was like, I know I'm like I don't want to say a ghost enthusiast, but I'd love the paranormal and shows. That's the one thing I haven't done here yet is a paranormal investigation. But it was too much to leave to the imagination. I had to say something to somebody. It was it was bizarre, but I remember her doing that and me asking her, and she just had this no look, like I wouldn't touch you, I don't know you, kind of thing. So
that's freaky. Mm-hmm. So just so everybody knows, Squawky and Spirits is our big Halloween event. We have like the Friday and Saturday right around Halloween, and we do have 2 haunted houses, including one that we opened just this last year. So this is the first time we'd ever had anybody in that area. The old prison infirmary in the back of Five House. It felt weird when we were building it, just a vibe when we were making this. And so thank you for being a guinea pig volunteer. And if anybody's interested in volunteering,
do it.
It's so much fun. It is a blast. All right. Excellent. Well, thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
For your time.
Appreciate it.
If you're interested in being a guest in this segment, send us an email, behindgraywalls@gmail.com, or find us on Facebook. All right, let's get back to the show.
Anthony, let's hear what you have got.
All right, so I am covering John Thomas Sayer, number 1912, 1912.
1912, that's the year the Titanic sank.
And that is the year that John Thomas Sayer was incarcerated. So he was
interesting. There might be a connection if I'm remembering a conversation we had earlier.
Yeah. So my sources today, his prison file located at the Idaho State Archives, Library of Congress chronicling America, Newsbank.com, collection of Idaho Daily Statesman digitized, newspapers provided by the Boise, Maine Library, newspapers.com, findagrave.com, ancestry.com, the Warren's Biennial Report, City of Rigby official website, a Britannica.com article on Philo Farnsworth, the National Archives piece of history blog article titled The Lost Battalion of World War I by Jesse Kratz, published on July 21st, 2017. John Thomas Sayer was born in Rigby, Idaho on October 14th, 1889, to John Henry and Miriam Amelia Atkinson Sayer. His parents were born in Utah and were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They moved west from East Weber, Utah in 1884. John Sayer Sr. first purchased a farm west of Rigby, but later established a farm southeast of Ryrie, Idaho. They had 10 children together, though 2 died at a young age. John Thomas Sayer, our subject, was sometimes referred to as Jack in newspapers and was the oldest boy in the family. He also had a cousin named John Richard Sayer, who was around the same age and in the same area, so
that was fun for you, I'm sure.
Yes, I apologize for any incorrect attribution. That was so difficult.
I hate that.
Yeah.
And you think you're like, I found it, and then there's one record that just plants that seed of doubt, and you're like, oh no.
Literally, I was going down. Yeah, I have a whole stream of John R. Sayer's things, and then realized that's the wrong John. Yeah. So, John Sr. operated a dry farm in Rigby, which the children would have spent their time helping with, and dry farming is exactly how it sounds. No irrigation and a reliance on snowpack, rainfall, or minimal water to raise deep-rooted crops like tomatoes, melons, squash, beans, grains, potatoes. Yeah. Potatoes, the
good old
ones.
Potatoes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the dry farms up there are crazy. They just go on and on.
And it makes sense too, right? We're in a high desert. Yeah. There are years that we don't have a lot of water, but you got to survive. So I think it's so amazing that people have been innovative enough throughout history to figure out what crops can survive in drier climates and stuff. So
while you were talking about Pocatello being the hub, we have this great Idaho TP brand potatoes, this potato sack here in our recording studio that I always love looking at this bad boy. But that was such a central hub for potato farming, and for this to be this roundhouse area. I mean, it just makes sense that Idaho and potatoes became so synonymous.
Okay. Do you guys want to hear a very funny story about my roommate? So my roommate is from New Hampshire, so he's from the East Coast, and one day he brought home a potato from the store, and I was like, Tom, oh my gosh, what are you gonna do with this? And he goes, well, I'm gonna eat it. And I was like, yeah, but are you going to mash it? Are you going to bake it? Are you going to what are we going to do with it? And he goes, oh yeah, I forgot who I'm talking to, who I live with. And I'm just like, you gotta prepare the potatoes in a right way because they are the best food ever. And maybe it's because I'm an Idahoan, but I feel like anyone you talk to is like, I love a good potato. Oh, everyone loves French fries.
Salad, potato salad.
Yeah,
I love.
Funeral potatoes. If you're from Utah or Idaho, love a funeral potato. You just cannot go wrong with a potato.
I don't know about you guys, but I always have a freezer bag full of twice baked.
Oh, that's so
just
smart.
So that I'm just ready at any time to have my potato fix.
So smart, Anthony. I'm gonna have to do that now. This summer will be the summer of the potato.
I love it. So, these dry farms, the weather can have a huge impact on them, but they can be so fruitful. I dug through several historic accounts of brutally hot summers and the detrimental effects that they had on these dry farms, while irrigated farms, tended to thrive in this weather. For those unfamiliar, Rigby is in eastern Idaho between Idaho Falls and Rexburg near the Wyoming-Idaho border. Besides farming, the Sayer family also ran a surprising business for a Latter-day Saints family. The Sayer brothers managed the Rigby Saloon, and I found several ads in the Rigby Star in which the Sayers were serving, quote, Salt Lake draft beer at 5 cents a glass, end quote. And then another ad proclaimed that the Sayer brothers, quote, besides serving Salt Lake beer at 5 cents per glass, handled the best wines, liquors, and cigars, end quote.
Interesting. It's like a little bit of a rabbit hole, but Real Housewives of Salt Lake, there is a housewife who she calls herself Mormon 2.0 because she owns a tequila business, but she's an active member of the church. Wow. But she does drink it. Anyway, I could go on for days about Real Housewives of Salt Lake. It is wild, but I won't, obviously. But that just, I feel like, I'd be curious to know if they partook in it or if it was one of those things where it was we'll just be in charge of it. We'll make money off of it.
Right. Yeah. Make money off of other people's vices.
Exactly.
No, this has been something I've been interested in a lot because, like, the last person we talked about, Ira Harder, who drank even though he was a practicing Mormon. I think those beliefs were a little more flexible back then.
Yeah.
Because, like, I found, like, saloon locations, Idaho Falls, Rigby, Rexburg, like, areas you wouldn't expect there to be a lot of heavy drinking.
Yeah.
It was still the West.
Well, and I wonder, too, how much of it, was, like, the water supply, right? Like, that forever is why people have had alcohol, is because, like, the water supply can be so, touch and go, especially in an area like southern Idaho.
It's clean.
Yeah, and so it's get all that bacteria out of it and stuff. So.
And limited entertainment. I mean, the saloon was a big social hub for, like, these early mining towns.
Totally. Boise on a Saturday night still is,
Go find Anthony playing at one of the clubs, I'm sure.
Yeah. So at the close of 1907, the Sayre Saloon was closed when their license expired. John Sayre Sr. decided to retire from the business, which is probably a good thing, as the local option laws, which we have discussed, which outlawed the sale of alcohol by a vote on the county level, was on the horizon and in that area. Samuel, you grew up in this part of Idaho. Did you spend much time in Rigby?
Yes, lots of time in Rigby. In very small towns, you spread out a lot, just because, like, your limited amount of friends, the limited amount of people to date. I mean, so I was in Ryrie all the time. I was in Rigby all the time.
Yeah.
One of my closest boxing buddies lived in Rigby. Okay. I remember doing, like, early training in, like, early garages and even in, like, potato cellars. Rigby's an interesting place for sure.
Nice.
That's it. Rigby's interesting. Period.
It has that kind of small town charm. It does have the TV museum, which I think you're probably talking about.
Philo T. Farnsworth, baby.
Yeah, that's right. The claim to fame for Rigby is the birthplace of the television. Philo T. Farnsworth, Rigby's most famous resident, invented the television. Something that impacts all of us on this earth today, pretty much.
Yes.
He was born in Utah in 1906, but his family picked up and moved to a farm in Rigby when he was a child, and the new farm had electricity, and as a young man, he was drawn to electrical generators and tinkering with motors. And this love evolved into a compulsion to invent a way to send information across a large distance, like a telephone, but through images. And he absorbed every resource he could about electricity and transference. And one day, while plowing a field, and according to some accounts, it was a potato field, a potato farm, at his family's Rigby farm, it hit him. Lines of electricity could be transmitted and controlled. And at the age of 21 in 1927, he invented the television, which could transmit moving images into a code that was broadcast through radio waves and translated by a television set. I mean, it's incredible.
Crazy, yeah.
And by the 1950s, it began to replace the classic radio within homes. And you can visit the Farnsworth TV and Pioneer Museum of the Jefferson County Historical Society next time you visit Rigby.
And just as someone who culturally studies sort of this early movement, like television, first of all, movies changed everything, but then you can have television. You don't have to leave your house to see these moving images. It changed everything.
Oh my gosh.
Well, and how would you be able to think about that concepts before those concepts existed?
Plowing a potato field? He's just out there just having these brilliant ideas.
Of course, you can make electrical waves transmitted. Hard to even think about.
He should be a national hero.
Honestly,
he
yeah.
Really should.
And he really wasn't very well known. It was just like this patent that was kind of bounced around. There was a transmission in San Francisco, and then New York starts the very first broadcast, and it's which I think is still running today. It's still active.
Really cool.
So nuts, but man, what an impact on society and culture.
Seriously.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
Mr. Farnsworth.
Wild.
Yeah. So back to John Thomas Sayre. He later listed his occupation as a barkeeper. He would have been out of business around 1908, and I couldn't find if he found a job at a different saloon, if somebody else purchased the saloon. digging through the Rigby newspaper through the BYU website, it was pretty difficult to find particular things. John's cousin, Nettie Sayer, actually worked in town as the chief telephone switchboard operator in Rigby. And so for younger listeners who don't know, until automation ended the need for switchboard operators, to call somebody, you needed to dial the telephone operator who would physically plug cables into a switchboard to connect you to another telephone in somebody else's home.
Dude. They have depictions of this in old movies, and like they just they know what wire to pull and where to put it. Like, it's so smart and so complicated. And and it was usually women. Like, that was traditionally like a woman's job back then. And just so smart, and they were so quick, and it was so impressive.
And you know, they've got the headset on. They're like, they have to make sure that the connection is good between the two. And so often they heard the gossip and all the secrets in town. Can you imagine
the gossip? I mean, we spoke about gossip, I think, a couple episodes ago, and I want that job.
I know. How fun.
So fun.
Honestly, like, that would have been a pretty cool job in town.
Yeah.
It would be like the barber. It would be like the person, you know, William Wilde in the barber shop, listening to all the gossip and knowing everything that's going on. And you know, you got to kind of keep your secrets, but...
Oof. I bet to the other telephone operators, you're like, guess what Mrs. Smith said? This is crazy.
Oh, 100%. I want to be a fly on the wall back in early 1900s for these. So, yeah, keep that in mind. In March 1908, 20-year-old Nettie Sayer went to a dance in Idaho Falls with a gentleman named Mr. Thomas. 19-year-old John Sayer also attended the dance with a local 20-year-old teacher named Mary Robb. Mary was a teacher in Rigby, and she was born in Wilford, Idaho on September 10th, 1887. And after attending school, she actually commuted. She also taught in St. Anthony, and by all accounts was a wonderful person and close to her family. Everybody seemed to really like her. A little after midnight, after that dance in March 1908, the quartet went to the Butte rooming house where they checked into 2 rooms. They told the clerk that one was for the young women, Mary Robb and Nettie Sayer, and the other was for John Sayer and Mr. Thomas. Of course, I wouldn't be telling this story if that was what happened. According to later accounts, John and Mary shared their room together until about 4 in the morning, if you catch my drift, and Nettie and Mr. Thomas did the same before swapping. They returned to their respective rooms, by the accounts, and the next morning got up just in time to check out and board the train back to Rigby. About 2 months after this dance, on June 7th, 1908, John shared a letter he received from Mary Robb with his cousin Nettie. According to her testimony later, quote, she said she wanted to see him and have a talk with him. She did not want her folks to know what condition she was in. She said she would be down to Rigby in a few days and would see him, end quote. Any guesses?
I remember the story.
What condition? Yes.
Yeah.
I wrote this for Faces. I don't remember this research.
A difficult condition in 1908 for an unmarried woman.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yeah. So she's about 2 months pregnant. Oof. A week later, on June 13th, 1908, Mary Robb was dead. Blackfoot, Idaho Republican printed, quote, Miss Mary Robb, who came here from Louisville 10 days ago to receive surgical attention, had to undergo a very dangerous operation and died. Her case was considered absolutely fatal without the operation, and blood poisoning was developed to add to the difficulty, end quote. Now, what follows is my best interpretation of the timeline of events taken from over 100 pages of newspaper depictions of the very salacious trial that occurred in July and August 1908, following her death. Obviously, this is a controversial subject that continues to be debated in American politics today, and depending on where and when you are listening to this episode, access to abortion may or may not be legal. So, let's go back to June 7th, 1908, when John shared this letter with Nettie. Nettie and John knew the gravity of the situation. Having a child out of wedlock in a conservative community, or any community really at this time, was going to ruin their reputation and solely their family's name. The agony of letting everyone down must have weighed heavily and guided their mutual decision. John would later be asked why he didn't propose to Mary, and John said he spoke to Mary about that, but was satisfied that there were other men who were, quote, equally responsible, end quote.
Oh, no.
This is all allegations. We don't know.
Well, and that's so easy for him to say once she's passed away. Like, there's no one to...
Yeah.
Come on, John.
Yeah. So Nettie makes a plan and approaches B.J. Humphrey, a bartender in Rigby known as Shorty in town. She told Shorty, "We're in trouble." He listened and called Dr. Frank W. Mitchell in Blackfoot, Idaho, and scheduled an appointment for the abortion. Dr. Mitchell told Shorty that they could call as soon as they arrived in Blackfoot. According to Nettie, who connected Dr. Mitchell and Shorty from her desk at the telephone operating switchboard, Shorty explained, quote, "There will be a couple of parties down tonight on train. One of them wants an operation. She is somewhat of a good fellow and knows enough to keep her mouth shut. Do the right thing by her," end quote. So Shorty Humphrey later denied speaking to Dr. Mitchell for Nettie, but Dr. Mitchell noted that he was taking care of Shorty's wife at that time in Blackfoot. He was warned that the parties were on their way to see him. After 2 trials, Shorty actually changed his story and was like, okay, yeah, I did talk to Dr. Mitchell about this. So Nettie Sayer, John Sayer, George Kite, their friend, and Mary Robb boarded a train to Idaho Falls and checked into the Brooks Hotel the evening of June 8th, 1908. The hotel keeper, George Neal, noted he saw Mary, Nellie, and John and George have dinner together that evening, and at no point did it appear that Mary Robb was ill or in any state of discomfort. On June 9th, Dr. Mitchell arrived at his office, which was on the 2nd floor of a drugstore called the Palace Drugstore in Blackfoot. The owner of the drugstore checked in with Dr. Mitchell, who said he had checkups he needed to attend to in town. He was taking care of a citizen who had measles and then another local woman who was pregnant in Blackfoot. Before leaving, he reaffixed a splint for a little boy who suffered from frequent spasms. That evening, after a full day of taking care of folks, he met Mary Robb around 4 p.m. Mary sat in a rocking chair in Dr. Mitchell's office and told him she had had a miscarriage and not all of it had passed. She also told the doctor that her name was May Brown, the same name that she used when she checked into a hotel. Dr. Mitchell told her to simply wait a few days and see if it would go away. Mary asked if another place might handle her condition, and he recommended the hospital at Mrs. Francis's. Mary agreed, and Dr. Mitchell actually introduced her to Mrs. Francis, then asked Mary how she felt. She said well, so Dr. Mitchell left and said he would check on her again. The next morning, Dr. Mitchell visited Mary at the hospital. When he arrived, Mary said she rested well, but had a chill. When he turned down her covers, he immediately noticed a septic odor, a smell he knew was a bad sign. Blood poisoning was settling in. Dr. Mitchell contacted Dr. Davis in town to help him perform on her. The 2 doctors went to work, and that afternoon they discovered a puncture in her womb. He made an incision on Mary's abdomen and attempted to scrape the womb. Quote, "That piece of placenta had passed through the puncture into the abdominal cavity, and that the last operation opening the abdominal cavity was to remove clots of blood and pieces of placenta that could not otherwise be reached or removed. That the puncture had been sewed up and then the organs replaced and the incision in the front wall of the abdomen sewed up," end quote. So whoever did this to you is incorrect. They're trying to fix it and save her. That night, she became delirious, and according to some accounts, she was speaking to school children. She's a teacher, and she's like telling the children in the room to like pipe down and all this stuff. Ugh. So, man, this breaks my heart. I'm so sorry. Like
Sam and I both just like hands on side of faces, just like jaws.
Yeah. Yeah. Oof. So, Dr. Mitchell asked her how long she had this puncture, but she wouldn't say. And later in court, it was noted that another doctor in attendance, quote, could feel the placental all about in the abdominal cavity and could detect it by pressing upon her abdominal wall. Quote. So she refused to speak. She refused to tell them, who attempted this on you. And he kept trying to treat her and take care of her. She was saying her name was Mae Brown. Finally, she admitted her true identity. And so he tracked down her family. Her parents and her sister Elizabeth immediately came to Blackfoot. Like Mary, Elizabeth lived in Wilford and worked as a school teacher. She noted that she saw her sister on June 8th, who appeared to be in perfect health, walking to the family home about a mile from the train station carrying a suitcase, and before her trip to Blackfoot. Mary told Elizabeth that she was going to be in Idaho Falls for about 3 weeks to learn dressmaking. So when they arrived at the hospital, a man named Mr. Weston pulled Elizabeth aside and explained what was going on. When she found out that Mary had a botched attempt at an abortion, Elizabeth knew not to tell her parents. The news would break her mother's heart. Mr. Weston said that he would explain that she was suffering from appendicitis. They kept the secret from Mary's family as long as they could. Elizabeth sat with Mary. Later at the trial, Elizabeth said Mary, quote, asked me if I thought she was going to die. I told her I thought she was. She said, do you think I'm dying now? Feel my heart. Feel it throb. Tell Helen I have to go. I asked her where she meant, and she said, over there. They're coming for me. Oh, sister, promise me you will never taste of beer, no matter who offers it. Promise me, feel my heart. Am I dying? I want to tell you something. Do you know all? I want to tell you who is responsible for my death, end quote. So when this testimony was occurring on the stand, Elizabeth just broke down crying. The state attorneys stood, and most of the courtroom had, tears in their eyes. Elizabeth was actually led out of the side room, and the defense demanded to hear what Mary said, and the state couldn't hold back any evidence that they had in the case. But that day, the court was adjourned. They stopped right there, and they were like, we're going to continue tomorrow. Oof. So the next morning, Elizabeth took the stand again, and she continued repeating what Mary said.
Oh, sister, feel my heart again. Am I dying? I'm afraid that you... Come closer. Do you know? Yes, Mary, I do know. And who is to blame for it? Oh, it is Jack and Nettie. Please forgive me, and don't never tell Papa and Mama. They've trusted me in every way. It would break their hearts, and maybe they would hate me. Where are Jack and Nettie? They went home. Did Dr. Mitchell do this? He tried so hard to help me. He worked over me for about 2 hours until I was so tired I could hardly raise my head. I never wanted you to know. I asked that rotten Jack for money, and he said, to hell with you, I haven't gotten any money. I couldn't look at him after that. Alma Hogan has been a friend to me. He loaned me $25. I don't know what I'd have done without it. You pay it back, won't you? Ugh. I cannot imagine having to face death in this way.
Just so fearful that you're going to break your parents' heart.
Yeah, that's their overriding concern will be for this, this action that you took instead of the way that you lived your life. And yeah, that's so hard.
What led up to that action?
This $25 that went to paying for the train, for the hotels, and likely to pay the doctor.
And to hell with you. To have the man that you at least undoubtedly had some feeling for, right, to be like, get out of here, sorry, can't help you.
Yeah, that's your problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, ugh. So while she is, at this hospital under Mae Brown, they all skip town. Nettie went to a Wild West show, like we talked about with William Wilde, just Wild West show going on in Blackfoot, and then skip town. John actually went to Montana for a few days. They just kind of dropped her off and was like, okay, good luck. We'll see you after this is all done, and we'll, be friends again.
As a plausible deniability kind of thing?
I think that may have been part of it, But I think that they thought,
it's going to go routine.
We'll take care of this. Yeah. We'll do the operation, whoever does it. So Elizabeth decided to go to John Sayers Sr., to John's dad, and explained everything that happened. And he immediately left Rigby and headed to Blackfoot, where he met Elizabeth and explained that John Jr. had cost him $5,000 in the last 3 years, and he couldn't believe after all of this support, John would add this to the mix. I couldn't find any details. It was probably all things that were taken care of by Dad, and oh man, he insisted that he would help pay for the funeral costs. On June 23rd, 10 days after Mary's death, she handed John a bill, $250 for the doctor's bills, $159.15 for undertaking, so $459.15 total. He said he couldn't take care of it right then because Alma Hogan was implicated. Why did Alma give her $25 if he didn't have some sort of connection with this pregnancy and abortion? So during her testimony, John Sayer Jr. Stared at Elizabeth in such a way that the judge actually forced him to sit at the other end of the table. So while all this is going on, he's just like staring her down, and he's hearing all of this conjecture. And I can only imagine John Sr. is probably in the courtroom as well. All of this weighing on both of them and their whole family. Just to have this connection. So the judge, hearing all of this testimony, put a bond for $2,000 on John Sayer Jr. and $1,000 for George Kite. John's father actually paid this bond. So he doesn't pay these hospital bills, but he pays his son's bond, and John is released. And shortly after that, John's mother gave birth to their final son. So it's like another member of the Sayer family is born, and she was like stricken with grief while she was giving birth with this son, that her son is involved in this abortion. So all of the accounts, the trauma that's going on in all of this, in this community, for all of these families involved is just like, heartbreaking. Now, before we continue, a lot of shade in the Blackfoot newspaper was placed on Rigby, just in general. And one of my favorite quotes that it came about during Dr. Mitchell's trial stated, quote, "A condition exists in the locality of Rigby in Louisville that is a disgrace to the state and puts free love to shame. A condition of promiscuous relation of the sexes that undermines the whole social fabric and reduces the rising generation to the level of cattle without a pedigree." End quote.
This is the time, though, that, like, women are really starting to, like, go out on unchaperoned dates. And, like, with the rise of amusement parks and the movies and all these new forms of amusement, that now they don't have to just go with their girlfriends. They can go out, or their families. Like, they can go out on their own. And, like, women are experiencing, a newfound freedom. But that this person clearly sees, I think, in the way that, we can look back in the 70s, and we can look back, I think, at any generation that says something similar. That there's just this new freedom that is affecting and is going to affect society moving forward.
It's such a surprise to me. Like, we've talked about it in so many episodes, that these are 20-year-old women who aren't married, and they're going on to town and checking into hotels with men that they aren't married to, and like, aren't they supposed to be married at 13? So preliminary hearings for John, Nettie, and George Kite were held in July 1908, and then Dr. Mitchell's hearing followed in August. And I included all the details laid out from these hearings in the recounting of Mary's final days. After a writ of habeas corpus was brought up for Dr. Mitchell, the state dropped its case against him due to a lack of evidence. And I have to add that he was beloved in the community, and his lawyer was James Hawley, who was the former mayor of Boise from 1903 to 1905, and later governor of Idaho from 1911 to 1913. So, I mean, he's a well-connected doctor, and he's on the stand. There's no evidence that he actually committed this abortion, that she came in with it having been done to her. So, who committed it? Honestly, I have no answer for that. So I have to add that Mary's body was exhumed for a post-mortem examination. It was discovered that her appendix was still intact. Dr. George Hyde examined Mary's exhumed body on June 29th at the cemetery in Wilford, Idaho, and he noted that all of her organs appeared to be in a healthy condition except for the ones operated on for a criminal operation, which resulted in her death. His opinion was that she died due to shock and hemorrhage. During cross-examination, he made it a point to say that there was no sign Mary was operated on for appendicitis. It was shown that the appendix had not been removed, was intact and in a healthy state. He laid out how poorly and carelessly the incisions were made. When asked if they had been done by Mary herself, he said, no, quote, that no woman would have the fortitude to finish such a puncture, end quote. He was asked if an incompetent physician had done it, and he responded that in all probability a physician had done it. With that, he responded, quote, operations of this kind are always done carelessly and hurriedly when done criminally. If there is a proper reason for the operation, it is done carefully, end quote. So when asked what would constitute an abortion, he stated, quote, to save the mother's life, end quote. After the 2 preliminary examinations, the state set a trial date for Nettie and John Sayer for February of the following year, so they actually dropped the charges on George. John pleads not guilty, and all of the evidence brought up above, from the intimate interactions to the letter and the trip to Rigby to Blackfoot, were brought before the jury. Nettie also testified against her cousin. On February 20th, 1909, the jury found John guilty of the crime of abortion. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in the Idaho State Penitentiary. A stay of proceedings by appeal was placed, but it came to nothing. For 3 years, basically unnoticed and forgotten about, John remained free.
What?
Yeah, so he's convicted in February 1909, but nobody takes him to prison. So...
I do remember that.
Yeah. So John Thomas Sayer remains at his father's farm and works for his father in Rigby. And he appears in the 1910 census, still living at his parents' house and working on the farm. On September 1st, 1911, Blackfoot's Idaho Republican published a story titled, Jack Sayer Never Punished. It explained that Jack had been free despite his conviction 3 years prior. Quote, the appeal has kept the matter tied up something like a year and a half, and in the meantime, Jack enjoys his liberty, and Miss Robb occupies a dishonored grave. Her old father and mother borrowed a sum of money on their home to hire attorneys to prosecute whoever was responsible for her ruin, and the last we knew of them, they expected to lose their home through their inability to pay off the mortgage. Our American judiciary was framed to give every man a chance to defend himself, and cases like this show how scoundrels take advantage of provisions made to protect the innocent from unjust punishment, end quote. They were not fans of John Sayer. The things I read about, whew. In May 1912, the heat started to turn up on John. The newspaper printed that his father was on the line after paying the initial bond if John didn't show up. A bench warrant for his arrest was placed by district court, but the warrant remained unserved. One of my new favorite connections stated that John's father, quote, was in England the day the Titanic sailed, and by some mishap he failed to secure passage on her as he desired, but took another vessel the next day, and he is still liable on the bond for Jack, end quote. So John's father was like on a mission in England, was going to board the Titanic on its way, back to the United States, but couldn't get a ticket. Luckily for him, because the Titanic sank on April 15th, 1912, which is just crazy. And because he survived and he didn't board that, he still owed, if John didn't turn up, he still had to secure that bond.
And so he was on an LDS mission in England.
Which was just like, wow.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so was that common for like late life missions?
Yeah, people with families usually in the earliest days. I don't know when it switched to the youth, but I know that in the earliest days they would send sort of, I think, the most capable and able people. Yeah. And I think I would assume they had to have had money. I don't know how much the church paid for it, and I don't know too much.
Yeah, I don't think the church paid for any of it in the early days. So. I think it was all like part of your giving to the church, service, was you're paying to get over there, you're paying to proselyte. Yeah. And and maybe you know this, I don't even know if they were like 2 years like they are now.
No, I think they kind of went and were kind of told when to come back. Okay. At least, but by night, I don't know, like that's in the earliest days, the 1840s, 50s, 60s. Yeah. So by the 1900s, I'm not sure what the mission policy was.
Right.
But I don't think it was youth until the 30s, 40s, 50s-ish.
Gotcha. And John Sayre Sr., his parents were born in England.
Okay.
And so he had a lot of family, a lot of Sayers in there.
And that might have, I wonder if that was part of the reason. It helps the expenses.
Totally.
And England was a really fertile place for Mormons to find, early Mormons to find these converts.
That's where my family came
I know,
from.
me too.
Yeah.
Literally, my family
same.
was converted in England and crossed the plains.
Crossed over, it's so funny. Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I think the LDS missions nowadays are very different than the Mormon missions taking place. And these times, I think, just to reiterate Skye's sentiment, nowadays there's a lot of strict regulation of the time, the age, the place. And I think back then it probably was a little more flexible.
It was like more about service and how can you serve the church and how can you help it grow on your own, I think. Yeah.
Wow.
Crazy. I didn't do it. It was too much for me.
Oh,
so.
my God.
Close call with that Titanic.
I know. Can you imagine? But the fact that he's still, I would be torn. I feel like if I was him, where I'm still on the hook. If my son doesn't show up, I could have been off the hook. But also, I did barely miss dying on the Titanic. Right. So
yeah. It was just like such a funny, weird thing. But that's how upset that they were in the newspaper. That why is justice not being served? Why is John Jr. Why is he not in prison right now?
That is crazy.
Right?
To be convicted and not be sent to the penitentiary.
And it's like they forgot or it was a willful thing.
Some money's going around somewhere.
Yeah. And there were a lot of mentions in the newspaper that there was something going on at this judge in Blackfoot. There were a lot of weird things going on, and there were a lot of allusions to other folks. Like there was a gentleman who was sent to the insane asylum, and everybody in the city was like, "No, this guy's not crazy. Why don't send him to the sanitarium? What are you doing?" And there's this whole crazy trial. I started going down the rabbit hole, and I was like, I don't have time to get to this. This is a whole different thing to jump into. So. Anyway, after all this coaxing from the newspaper, a warrant was placed for John's arrest, and he attempted to flee and traveled 40 miles through the night when officers caught up to him and arrested him in a stable. He was immediately taken to the Idaho State Penitentiary to serve his 3-year term. Quote, had he started to serve his sentence soon after he was convicted, Sayre would now have been a free man, but instead, when the hands of the law were not upon him, he naturally chose not to come of his own will, end quote. So, intake. John Thomas Sayre, number 1912, received May 30th, 1912. Crime, abortion, sentence 3 years. Bingham County, born in Rigby, Idaho, 22 years old. He's 5 feet 6.5 inches tall. He had a medium complexion. He's 132 pounds. His hair was brown and thin on top. His eyes were brown. His occupation was barkeeper. He served an apprentice as a barkeeper. Both his parents were still living. He left his parents' home 2 years earlier at the age of 20. He had religious instruction as a Mormon and was still a member of the church. He attended 7 years of school and had a common school education. He listed himself as a moderate drinker. He had no former imprisonment. His closest relative was his mother living in Rigby. His build and features were regular. His teeth were in good condition. He didn't have a beard and wore a size 6 boot and a size 7 hat. His clothing was stored in the commissary, and his father was born in England and his mother was born in the United States, even though his father's obituary said he was born in Utah. He resided in Idaho all 22 years of his life, and his Bertillon showed a scar on his right cheek, a lump scar under his lower lip, and lump scars on his left and right wrists. And Warden Snook also noted that he had rough skin on his body and noted small scars on his palm and the back of both hands. You can see his mugshot and his nice little bow tie.
I know, he's looking a little dapper.
John would have arrived soon after the completion of the newest cell house at the time, Two House. And with his background in farming, he may have had the opportunity to help with prison farms here on the grounds. It appears he was not planning to serve his whole sentence. He immediately hired an attorney to bring an action against the prosecuting judge. Surprisingly, within the first 6 months of his incarceration, the Supreme Court of Idaho agreed to hear John's case based on a writ of mandate written against District Court and a sentencing judge, J.M. Stevens. The writ of mandate stated that Judge Stevens, quote, refused and neglected to settle, sign, and file a bill of exceptions and statement in the action of appeal, and asked that he be required to show cause why he has not done so, end quote. The judge said that it was John's delay that caused the lack of action. Part of the recap of his charge and sentence included the note that he adamantly denied performing the abortion and said that Nettie, Shorty, Alma Hogan, and Dr. Mitchell were the guilty parties and that he had nothing to do with it. On November 27, 1912, John Sayer's case was heard. It passed, which meant that he would be able to have the case reviewed by the Supreme Court. Judge Stevens was forced to send all of John's appeal transcripts to the Supreme Court and actually sit in judgment by the Supreme Court to determine if John could receive a new trial. In January 1913, John requested bail so he could prepare for the Supreme Court trial outside the prison. So here is the summary of the opinion by Judge C.J. Alshey in State v. Sayer. In this case, it is insisted by counsel for the appellant that there is absolutely no evidence whatever establishing the guilt of the appellant, and that the jury had before them no evidence upon which to rest a verdict. At the oral argument, the Assistant Attorney General stated that he had been unable to find any evidence in the record which justified a verdict of judgment of conviction. The Attorney General's office has furnished us with a digest of all the evidence in the case and cited us to everything that could be considered as a circumstance or suspicion against the defendant. After examining this, as well as the transcript of evidence, we are still left to wondering upon what grounds the jury returned a verdict of guilty. There is certainly no evidence justifying it in the record. In the meanwhile, it appears the defendant has served well nigh a year in the penitentiary. The judgment is reversed, and the defendant will be discharged. By an order of the Supreme Court, John was discharged from the prison on March 11, 1913. He walked out a free man, but had no legal recourse for his nearly 1 year in prison. Despite most newspapers making him the villain, some appeared to reverse their perception of John and called for, quote, some recompense to persons who have been unjustly convicted of crimes. Society is not slow to punish the guilty, and oftentimes continues the punishment after the law has been satisfied. Where society is guilty of the crime, it should at least recompense the guilty party, end quote. The Idaho Republican from Blackfoot did not agree and continued stating that, quote, they know very well that Sayer belongs in the penitentiary and it is wrong to ever let him out, end quote. Regardless, John Sayer returned to eastern Idaho. In late June, a few months out of prison, while he was riding down some mountains 70 miles south of Rigby, the horse he was riding fell. John tumbled off and broke his right arm just below the right elbow. He tried to take care of it himself, but ended up going to town in Rigby after a couple of days to have it tended to. The injury appeared on his World War I service card. So, John apparently kind of lived in the area and continued to work on his father's farm, but he entered the United States service on June 15th, 1918 in Elko, Nevada. He served in the 15th Company, 4th Battalion, 166th Depot Brigade in Camp Lewis, Washington, until July 15, 1918, when he joined Company L, 160th Infantry, 40th Division, which he held until September 20th, 1918, when he joined Company F, 308th Infantry, 77th Division, until the time of his death. He went overseas with the 40th Division on August 8th, 1918, to serve in World War I. And for World War I buffs, John Sayer was part of the 100 Days Offensive, which included an injection of American artillery forces and casualties that ultimately ended the war in November 1918. He was extremely close to being a member of the Lost Battalion of World War I, but his company, F, which was not called amongst the battalion, which included companies A, B, C, E, G, and H. So these men were cut off from the rest of the Allied troops for 5 days between October 2nd through 7th without food and supplies and being charged on all sides by German soldiers. They held their ground and helped hold and move the line for the Allies. On October 16th, 1918, 2 days after his 29th birthday, John and the F Company marched into the Musée Argonne near Grand Prix to fight as part of the Allies' offensive, which had started a month before. Quote, after furious fighting, the division found itself in line from north of Grand Prix to a point south of Champagnelle, end quote. On October 19th, 1918, John Thomas Sayer was killed in action. The Army attempted to contact his family, but failed at first. On December 18th, 1918, John was listed as missing in action in the Idaho Statesman. He was buried in the Musée Argonne American Cemetery and Memorial in France. The white cross that bears his name says John T. Sayer, Private 308th Infantry 77th Division, Nevada, October 19th, 1918. His family found out about his death at the end of the year. Like so many soldiers, it was nearly impossible to get that word back. So complicated story. He was a veteran who served his country and
died for his country. And a month after his death, the war ends. And it was on the backs of boys like him, young men like him.
All the conscientious objectors who said this isn't our war to fight, and all the American men who died for a war that only vaguely really involved the United States. And so I would be curious to know if, but at the same time, the families of those who did fight, of course, have every right to be proud. And I'm sure John's family absolutely mourned that loss for this war, this great, the Great War. They didn't even call it World War I because it was a scale that was unimaginable and just horrendous conditions. I think he's such a good example of how complicated people are, right? And that's what's so important about this podcast is that, yes, he might have done this morally objectionable thing or been involved in some way.
Yeah.
But then he went and he did such a valiant, brave thing that we can't paint him one way or the other, right? Just like we can't and shouldn't paint anyone else one way or the other, right? Yeah. So he's a fascinating story and an always prescient subject, which history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, people are so complicated, and the criminal justice system, when you're in it, there's chance of redemption and change and evolution and being a different person after your incarceration. And I think, John, I couldn't find any account of him ever being married, of ever having a family. He came from such a big family. He came from the LDS faith. That was a surprise, and I wonder if the stigma of his crime and his namesake, that affected his chance of ever doing that.
In such a small town.
Yeah. And so, if you have no family to live for, then living and dying for your country is a pretty valiant way of spending the rest of your time. But wow.
And maybe he thought the war would help sort of restore his reputation. I mean, he was young. At the end of the day, he had plenty of time to come home and have a family.
Right. Yeah.
Poor Mary.
Mary. Yeah, and that's such a good point.
The victim,
absolutely.
The victim,
and Mary's
and her family.
Oh, the sister.
The sister having to testify to his face and talk about what undoubtedly must have been the worst moments of her life to watch her sister die.
The shame and confusion of the family,
It's heartbreaking and such a political subject. But we see it in the news every single day. Just yesterday, news dropped in about the abortion pills.
That's right.
And so we're recording this on June 14th, 2024, and the Supreme Court allows abortion pills. Idaho, it's illegal still in Idaho. Right now, today, this could change, but it's legal to go across state lines to Oregon or Washington to another area and then bring the pills back from another state. So that's still a legal thing. But, this podcast, we're a part of our time right now. And if you're listening to this in 5 years, who knows where abortion will be.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think that, looking back at the generations who fought for that right to be enshrined nationally, never thought that it would be taken away. And so we're kind of in a new space exploring what that means for us as a country. And it's divisive and it's difficult. And I don't think it's ever going to be an easy topic from now on.
Yeah.
And never not emotional.
Yeah.
Oh
yeah.
my
So
God.
true.
Right. Yeah.
Like there's few issues that will drop such emotions from everyone in the room
everyone
has
an opinion.
Thinking about the child that Mary lost, from that perspective, that's heartbreaking. To Mary, to her family, to everybody involved in this case,
And
it's
just in the hope that it was just routine, right, for her. Like she went in and just like, we'll take care of it, and like I'll be able to move on, and like, but also the probability that even if she had lived, because of how dangerous, undoubtedly this procedure was, like there may have been a high chance she couldn't have had children after that. And that, is heartbreaking in itself. But then you add the loss of Mary onto it. And again, just like we talked about, the loss of her potential. She was so young too.
And a teacher, like she was
around children, clearly loved children. And
think of like those kids who now get a front seat hearing what's an abortion, what is this, they must be hearing the news about how their teacher passed away. How does that affect that whole generation? Like,
and who performed the abortion?
That's
so
very
like
good question.
like because they said it was like a surgeon, but clearly it wasn't a super good surgeon,
right?
And so and like, was it like a friend in an alley, or was it someone who pretended to have some medical certification?
Or there often were like women in the community who knew women's anatomy and had ways to try to induce miscarriages and abortions, and it's so heartbreaking for everyone. Like this is just a tough subject, a tough story, but I think it's important to talk about. I think it's always important to talk about these issues, even if it is hard and even if politically we are divided on them, because I just don't think in America this topic is ever going to be resolved, or at least not for a long while.
And clearly it's part of the history. It's part of the history of the country, the state, the prison.
It's always been a part of women's history.
Absolutely.
Like from the earliest times, unwanted pregnancies or pregnancies that are inviable for whatever reason, that's always been something that women have had to deal with, and the people around them have had to deal with. And so, great job covering a really difficult topic, a really difficult story, and thank you for covering that.
Oh, yeah. No other person that I've come across has been charged with abortion. No other man has been charged with an abortion.
Yep, that's right.
Like that. So it's such a unique part of our history, and then for his release so suddenly, it's
and that he was out
for
for 2 years before he went in.
It's like they almost didn't know how to convict him or how to punish him for this.
For his
such
part.
a strange So thank you for your patience for me to write this episode, and
worth
I've
the
been
wait.
like struggling. How do I tell this story? But I think it needs to be told.
Yes, absolutely. So, great job.
Good job to both of you.
You too.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Everybody stay safe on the road this summer. It's the 100 bloodiest days in Idaho. They've been saying that for 70 years. That's what they call this summer. We have such dangerous, roads. If you're heading up to McCall, up to northern Idaho, to eastern Idaho, like, be safe, everybody.
Take care of yourselves. Take care of others.
Take care of each other.
Be kind. Be kind.
Be kind to yourselves.
Yes.
Especially listening to this stuff.
All right. Well, we love you all, and thank you so much. Do your own time.
Do your own number.
Bye, everybody.
If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Not only do we get to hear your feedback about the show, but it helps others find us as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the podcast and to see mugshots of the inmates featured in today's episode, follow our Facebook group at Behind Gray Walls Podcast. And we have a podcast Instagram as well. You can find us on Instagram at Behind Gray Walls Pod.